Okay, so welcome everyone to our 16th of 18th sessions on Jewish literacy. And the subject this evening is life cycle events, as we'll see, from birth to death, including Brit Milah, which is circumcision and naming, B'nai Mitzvah, marriage and intermarriage, divorce, and funerals. A lot to cover. As always, I want to acknowledge the support of the Federation and the Affordable Living Trust, and point out actually two things. One, as always, recordings of these and just about everything else I do is on my website. And now for those of you, and in particular for those of you who are studying for conversion, this is a requirement. And for those of you who would like an official looking certificate at the end of this class, it's also a requirement. And that is to, if you go again on my website, into classes, into the Jewish literacy program, you will see a downloadable final exam. Whoops, hang on, I'm gonna mute. You know what, okay. So that there is a final exam. It's open book. It shouldn't be a challenge to you. And the other thing is, I am attempting to keep track, and even as I say that, I don't have my sheet in front of me, of the people who are studying for conversion as to when you're attending, who's attending which class. I have not attempted to keep track of that in general, and it would be really hard because there are a lot of people that are just watching the videos. So I'll basically ask you to self-certify. If you cheat on a spirituality program, you're not getting anything out of it anyway. So I'm not actually that concerned. Okay, so having dispensed with the preliminaries, let's talk about life cycle in Judaism. And of course, Judaism, as you've heard over and over again, is more than just prayer. It is more than just a theology. It's more than just studying holy texts. It is very definitely a way of life. And certainly in the rabbi world, we are very conscious of the idea that when people are going through a life cycle, you know, birth, maturity, as I say in the words of Rabbi Harold Schulweis, and I'll mention this again later on, when they are hatched, matched, and dispatched, at times of relating to birth, weddings, and funerals. These are what we call in the theology biz liminal moments, moments when your status is changing, and you're aware of it, I guess, except when you're about to die, or when you actually die. But certainly people around you are aware of it, and in the other life cycle events, you too are also aware of it. And it's a time when people turn to religion and to their culture for inspiration and guidance. And as I say here, it's a time when even the least observant people will focus on the specifics and minor details of Jewish law. So I've mentioned this in general in the past. You know, I've worked with people who are focused on, let's say, particularly in a funeral, they want to get everything exactly right. And what does Judaism say about this? And it is okay to delay the funeral. And, you know, what kind of casket should I get? Should I get a showman? I'm going to discuss all the specifics. These are people who, by and large, don't worry about other elements of Jewish law. These are people that are probably not keeping kosher. They're probably not praying once a week, never mind praying 3 times a day, and so on. But it is absolutely true. You know, it was true of my father. My father was one of the least observant people who was still proudly Jewish that I can think of. But when my mother died, he insisted on absolutely everything being strictly according to Jewish law. And for him, that was a way of honoring my mother. And, you know, in words of others, it's a time when we step back from the canvas to appreciate, to compare and appreciate our lives and the lives of our families. Rachel.
Rabbi, quick question. This is Mike. When your father was strictly observing the funeral process of of your mother at the time, was it because of his understanding that death, and you'll probably discuss this further, but in the Jewish life, death needs to be assisted by those of the living at the time in order to go through that rite of passage or to go on to the next step? Can you shed some?
To be honest, I'm not sure. I'm going to mute everyone, and you can unmute yourselves. I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that. Basically, particularly with death, quite often people just don't know what to do. So it is actually very comforting to have somebody tell them, this is what you're supposed to do. It's one of the things I learned. And again, just getting ahead of the story, at a funeral, I remember the death of a fairly young man, I would say in his late 30s, early 40s, and his young widow was terrified to watch him be buried. And she was very much torn by whether she should be there at the interment as he was being buried. And I remember having a conversation with her and, basically asking, what is it you really want to do? And I know you're not strictly observant. This is what Jewish law says. And I went back and forth with her. And then I finally realized, this was fairly early in my rabbinic career, she wanted me to tell her what to do. She did not want to have a discussion about theology. She was in a terrible place, and she wanted to know, what does Judaism tell her to do to honor her husband? And that's what's going on in many of these situations. So, and it certainly is what was going on with my father and my mother, observing Shiva and so on. That was, that was the way he felt. He and God and my mother, were in communication and working together to get through this. And, it's also, then you don't have to figure it out. On one level, being Orthodox takes away a lot of decision making. I'm not saying it's easy, in terms of keeping 2 sets of dishes and keeping kosher and so on and so on. But in the world of Orthodox observance, there's not a lot of questioning. You know exactly what you're supposed to do. There is, I believe, great comfort in the idea that God has told us what God expects of us. And yes, sir, I'm going to do it. So let me move on. Okay, birth. Jewish attitude toward birth is very much pro birth. It is a mitzvah. Some would say the first commandment in the Torah is pru uvru, be fruitful and multiply. And the Torah doesn't get any more specific than that. It won't surprise you to learn that the rabbis who are hyper attentive to specificity will get more specific, and they will say, in order to fulfill the commandment of pru uvru, being fruitful and multiplying, you should have at least 2 children, 1 of each gender. And then you've discharged your responsibility. And of course, many people, particularly in the Orthodox world, will have many more children than just 2. But in most cases, with a mitzvah, Judaism will guide you into what you're supposed to do to fulfill the mitzvah. You're supposed to eat matzah during a Seder. There's going to be in the tradition how much matzah you should eat to fulfill that mitzvah. It's actually the volume of an egg. And we can get into this. And of course, if a couple or an individual can't have children, then the mitzvah doesn't command you to do something that you can't do. And then in other rabbinic traditions, your students and people you influence are considered to be your children, but absolutely in favor of having children. And then we'll move right toward Brit Milah or Bris. The word Bris, with which most Jews are familiar, is simply an Ashkenazi way of saying Brit. The Hebrew word Brit means covenant. So the full name for the ceremony is Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision. And that one is clearly commanded to Abraham in the Torah, and it's commanded that he is commanded by God to circumcise his sons at the age of 8 days. And the rule is in traditional Judaism, and I would say even not so traditional Judaism, is the 8th day is very significant. And it's significant certainly in Jewish tradition, because you have a circumcision take place even if the 8th day is Shabbat. So the commandment to circumcise overrides, what you might think might be work. It actually complicates things, because on Shabbat, you're not allowed to carry things from one domain into another. So a mohel, the person who does milah, is called a mohel, or moil in the kind of the Yiddish Ashkenazi pronunciation, will actually have to be within walking distance of the home, might very well stay in the guest room in the home. He certainly will have to have his instruments at the home, because he's not allowed to transport them from one place to another. It even takes place on Yom Kippur. You even have a circumcision taking place on Yom Kippur. There's actually interesting issues about, you're supposed to drink some wine at a circumcision. So how do you handle that? I mean, if there's a lot of curiosity, I can tell you. And the only reason for delaying a circumcision is if there's a medical reason not to have the circumcision. And certainly, if you have a very premature baby boy, and the medical authorities would say, don't have a circumcision on the 8th day of the baby boy's life. As I think you know by now, health and safety override every commandment, almost every commandment, and certainly this one. And then once you've delayed the circumcision beyond the 8th day, then you would not have a circumcision on Shabbat or on Yom Kippur. And I don't know if this is still true, but certainly when hemophilia was a real issue, there could be reasons not to circumcise a boy at all, and you would not circumcise a boy if there was a danger of affecting the baby's health. It is a symbol of entering into the covenant. It does not make the boy Jewish. The boy is Jewish. I think, as you know, traditionally, if his mother is Jewish, there's really no other issue. So even if the child is not circumcised, either due to, just laziness or inattention, or now I would say, there's more people, certainly in the more liberal Jewish world, who don't believe that they should circumcise their baby boys, but it doesn't affect the status of the child as being fully Jewish. There are a number of prayers, and of course the mohel is very familiar with these prayers and will lead what I'll just call a service. And then it is not unusual for me to be called upon to say the prayers with, let's say, a surgeon, urologist, or pediatrician present to actually do the circumcision, and I will recite the prayers. And then there's a lot of traditions that the child is held by a honorific title called the sandek. Traditionally, you actually ask the child's father. It's the child's father's responsibility to do the circumcision, and I would ask the child's father, or the mohel would ask the child's father, do you want to do this, or do you want me to? Are you delegating me as your agent to do this? And it's pretty common that the child's father will be thrilled to delegate it. I actually did officiated a circumcision a while ago, where I think the mother was a surgeon and the child's father was a surgical nurse. And I would say either of those parents could have done the circumcision, but they wanted to have a mohel do the circumcision. And there's blessings for, it's a mitzvah blessing, which ends with bringing the child into the covenant with our father Abraham. And then we pray for a life of Torah, marriage, and good deeds. And typically not typically, traditionally, a Hebrew name is given to the child at that time. Part of the tradition is to have an empty chair, which is designated as Kisei Eliyahu, the chair of Elijah. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is traditionally it is taught that Elijah will bring the Messiah. So with the birth of a new life, who knows, this child may be the Messiah. So the hope is, if not the child being the Messiah, will be ushering a messianic age. And there's also a very interesting story. If you read the story of Elijah in the books in the Bible, Elijah loses faith in God. So one of the traditions is that because Elijah lost faith in God, God commands Elijah to show up at every circumcision to kind of help restore Elijah's faith, that indeed we are still entering our sons into the covenant of Abraham. Converts to Judaism who are male either need to be circumcised, who are not circumcised in traditional Judaism would need to be circumcised. If they are already circumcised, which is certainly very common in this country, and I would guess 90% or more of the male converts that I've worked with are already circumcised. So then you draw, one draws a drop of blood from where the foreskin used to be. It's called Hatafat Dam Brit. And then in Reform Judaism, as I've described it, I'm sure a number of times, ritual commandments really are between you and God. And I would say in issues like this, your rabbi or the Beit Din will be involved. But I think there are official Reform responsa, which is Reform rulings, to basically saying that circumcision is optional in the Reform world. Some of you are planning to go through the Sandra Kaplan Beit Din, which lives up to conservative Jewish standards, and their circumcision is not optional. It is absolutely mandatory. And then for girls, again, one of the hallmarks of Reform Judaism is to treat boys and girls, men and women, equally as much as possible. Clearly, there is no surgical equivalent for girls in circumcision, but the ceremony and the blessings and so on are virtually identical. So it is quite common that I will be called upon to do baby namings. So again, it's very common for me months after the child has been circumcised, or if it's a boy, has been circumcised, often in the hospital, at the age of a day or two, occasionally later, occasionally not circumcised at all. And baby girls, they might be 2-3 years old. The parents will decide they want to have a naming, and so I will be called upon and will conduct a naming ceremony. So I have some images about what this looks like and a little bit of surgical images. I have witnessed lots of surgeries of babies being circumcised, and then typically the foreskin is pulled forward, it's clamped, so there's no danger of hurting the glands of the penis. And I've also been present, I may have described it, at the circumcision of an adult, and it looks more like the image you see there. And this is kind of what you often see. This is at a Bris or a Brit Milah. So a word or two about naming. A traditional name of a Jew is your Hebrew name, or it could be a Yiddish name, and then son or daughter in traditional Judaism of your father. And in Reform Judaism, it would be your father and your mother. So my Hebrew name is Moshe. I'm named after my grandfather, whose Hebrew name was Moshe, ben, son of Chonan. That's my father's Hebrew name and Yiddish name. And my mother's name was Croatia. And I actually have no idea what her Hebrew name is. And I have no idea what that means. Actually, I should talk to a knowledgeable Yiddish speaker, because I'm sure it's a Yiddish name. So that would be a typical Hebrew name for a male. For a female, it would be, let's say her name was Batya, it would be Batya Bat Moshe V'Sarah. So that's a Hebrew name. When I'm working with couples on weddings, I will always be asking, do you know your Hebrew name? And they may know it, they may know it's Batya or Moshe, but then they have to do some homework and find their parents' Hebrew names. In the Ashkenazi world, but not in the Sephardic world, there is a strong, I would call it a superstition or tradition of not naming a child after a living relative. And there are a couple of traditions that go along with this that have as their basis the idea that the angel of death is not very bright. So the idea here is that the fear is the angel of death is coming to take, Grandpa Yitzchak, and he comes to the house, and Yitzchak's grandson, who's also named Yitzchak, is in the crib or the playpen, and you have this image of the angel of death checking his or her notes and looking around, and the worry is they might take the wrong Yitzchak. That's only in the Eastern European Ashkenazi world. In the Sephardic world, it would almost be an insult not to name a child after a living grandfather. There's a joke I heard the other day that how do we know that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were Ashkenazi? And the answer is if they were Sephardic, it would have been Abraham, Isaac, and Abraham as the three patriarchs. There's another superstition having to do with illness where people are very ill, a superstition, probably Ashkenazi as well, of changing the ill person's name. So again, Yitzchak is very ill, so they change his name to Chaim. Once again, the angel of death is looking for Yitzchak, comes to the house, can't find Yitzchak, it's only Chaim, so the person is spared. And quite often there is a beautiful link between the child and the departed relative, both certainly in the eyes of the child's parents and grandparents. And then as the child grows up, hopefully the child will have some curiosity about, tell me about, my grandmother, grandfather, great grandfather, after whom I am named. The naming for a boy traditionally takes place, as I mentioned, at the Bris. In fact, in many traditions, certainly in Chabad, no one will know the name of the boy until the Brit Milah, and then traditionally a girl is named the Sabbath following her birth, when the father is going to Sabbath services, is called to the Torah for an aliyah, and as part of his traditional world, his aliyah, he would announce the name of his daughter. And as I mentioned, in the Reform world, it is far more common to have a specific naming ceremony. And I probably do half a dozen baby namings a year. And it's quite often at home. And then sometimes it will actually be at a synagogue. So I've done it like on a Friday night service. It's actually a wonderful thing to have at a Friday night service to bring up the baby and have a naming. There's also something which is really not observed in the Reform world called Pidyan Haben. And that means literally the redemption of the son, S-O-N. And the tradition is that the firstborn male child in the Bible belongs to the temple to serve in the temple, to be sort of an assistant to the Levites and the priests. Minor issue, temple hasn't existed for 2,000 years, but that certainly is not going to slow us down. So the rule is that if your firstborn child opens the womb, and by that I mean, if the first son is also the firstborn. So if you've had a daughter first, then you do not have a Pidyan Haben for your second child, who would be a son. And if you've had a miscarriage or an abortion, either clinical or spontaneous, that has opened the womb, that does not, that precludes the baby boy having a pidyon haben. Or if the parents are either Kohen or Levite. So then what happens is there's a ceremony, and I've only done this once or twice. We actually did it for my son way back before I was a rabbi. And basically there is a ceremony, and you invite a Kohen, someone who traces their lineage back to Aaron, and you give typically $5 silver to the Kohen. They have ceremonial coins that you can use, and typically that's donated to charity. And what I found out later, the reason my son had a bris, the reason he had a pidyon haben was because we lived in Connecticut. I'll talk more about the fact that my son's bris was on July 4th. That's an interesting little side story, tell at the end. In Connecticut, but my parents who lived in New York wanted to have a big party in New York. So if it takes place in 30 days after birth. So we had this big pidyon haben. And what I realized, when my son was probably in his 30s, is it was actually not appropriate to have a pidyon haben because his mother, my late wife, was a Levite. So we should not have actually had a pidyon haben. And it's very uncommon, I would say, in the Reform world. And generally speaking, in the Reform world, male and female are treated the same as much as possible. And there is I can't think of anything official in the Reform world where we treat Kohanim or Levites differently. In other, in conservative and Orthodox tradition, there are laws relating to Kohanim and Leviim. And I won't get into it, but that doesn't exist in the Reform world. Okay, any questions on birth? I think I'll just pause for a moment and see if there's any questions. Take a little drink of water.
I do have one, Rabbi.
Go ahead. Yes.
So I know, just to clear it up. So I know you said if a child is born to a Jewish mother, they're Jewish. But what if the father is Jewish, and the mother isn't? Would they still be considered?
Okay, so in the Orthodox and conservative world, absolutely not Jewish at all. And I always say there's no such thing as being half Jewish. In the Reform world, since men and women, again, the goal is to treat men and women equally, the Reform world adopted a very controversial position, and it actually only applies in the United States. I think Canadian Reform doesn't go along with this. And so I know that Israeli Reform doesn't go along with this. But the rule for Reform is the child of a Jew and a non-Jew is presumed to be Jewish, and that presumption is confirmed by raising the child Jewishly, or I think it's called in the committee report in the response, some acts of identification and affiliation. So what would those be? It would be a baby naming and a circumcision. It would be the child going to Hebrew school. It would be having a Baramba Mitzvah, confirmation, and so on. So in theory, this happens all the time in the Reform world. You have a Jewish father and non-Jewish mother. Child is raised Jewishly. In the Reform world, the child is considered Jewish. And then there can be an issue because in the conservative and Orthodox world, the child would not be considered Jewish. What is even more interesting, but also happens quite often, is you have the child of a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father, and the child is not raised Jewishly. So technically, or I should say theoretically, that child would not be considered Jewish by the Reform movement, but would be considered Jewish by the conservative and Orthodox movement. And in reality, what happens is the rabbis put their heads together and figure out what we're going to do. So I would not say we're rigid on that.
Right.
And then even more interestingly to me, this one's going to puzzle you, I think, puzzled me. The issue is the womb. And this really becomes an issue with in vitro fertilization and surrogate parentage. So in theory, and now I'll just stick to the conservative and Orthodox world. If you have a Jewish father and a Jewish mother and do in vitro fertilization, so the child's genetics is 100% Jewish, but that embryo is implanted in a surrogate who is not Jewish, in strict Jewish tradition, that child would not be considered Jewish. And the reverse is also true. If you have an egg where neither parent, biological parent, is Jewish, but the surrogate is Jewish, the child would be considered Jewish because the womb is Jewish. Don't ask me to defend this, but that's actually the ruling. So I'm going to call on a couple of people. First, Mick, and then Rachel or Michael. I'm not sure who's there. Mick, you're muted.
I just realized that, sorry. Quick question. So it seems to me that in Judaism in general, like Hebrew school is something that I am hearing a lot being mentioned, and it seems a bit more important than, like, I was raised Catholic. I did go to Catholic school, but it's like not, most kids I know who are Christian or Catholic didn't. Is there a reason that that is more important aside from like the community being smaller and community being more important in Judaism? Is that
so
a big part?
in a way it's more important, and in a way it's irrelevant, because in Jewish tradition, if your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. It doesn't matter whether you go to Hebrew school, it doesn't matter whether you have a Hebrew name, it doesn't matter whether you're circumcised, nothing matters. But then you have this funny issue with Reform Judaism, which would say if you have one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent, the critical issue is being raised Jewishly, or acts of identifying with the Jewish people. So then we have to figure out what those are. And it really would be up to the rabbi to figure out what those are. And, you know, just bouncing over into the Christian world, in the Christian world, again, 43,000 different Christian movements, but in the Christian world, the issue is correct belief. So someone whose neither parent is Jewish, but at age, I don't know, 67, decides that Jesus is my Lord and Savior, is Christian. So there's not a peoplehood element in it. It is purely a religion, in the sense that it's really a matter of your religious belief. Larry.
Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about adoption? You hadn't talked about adoption of a baby being Jewish or not.
Yeah, so I for some reason I have a mental barrier against remembering exactly what Reform Judaism says, but I'm pretty sure that if you have a Jewish couple adopting a non-Jewish baby, that because they're raising the child Jewishly, the child would be considered Jewish by Reform. I'm actually not 100% sure of that. What is actually quite common is that parents will go through what I would call a pro forma conversion. Namely, you would take the baby, the newborn baby, and if it's a boy, either have a circumcision or a hatfat brit. And if it's a boy or a girl, you would take the baby to the mikvah, and you would have a conversion. And that's pretty common, I would say, in the Reform world and in the traditional world. Barbara, I saw you raising your hand. Did you want to comment on that? You're muted.
While she's becoming unmuted.
Rabbi, just really quickly, I still had a question pending.
Okay.
Let me just ask Barbara if she wanted to comment on that particular point.
Go ahead. It's okay.
Okay. So, Michael.
Oh, no, Barbara, if you wanted to go ahead, that's fine.
I was just going to say, my son is adopted. And at the time, I knew next to nothing about Judaism, not being raised in an environment that practiced it all. And in the hospital, they asked me, did you want us to circumcise your son? And I said, sure. Yeah, I have a doctor doing it. That's good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And but I vetted all the preschools to send him to the best one to give him the best education. And Chabad seemed to be the most warm and receptive and all that. So mm-hmm. I sent him there for 6 years. He went to Chabad, and then we started talking about the ritual of Bar Mitzvah, and they couldn't do it for him.
Right. Yes. So.
he would have needed to live a year, the whole family as Orthodox Jews, or he would need a Brit Milah. And so he was given a choice. And Rabbi Greenbaum was the one who spoke to him. We came here, and Rabbi Greenbaum said, well, here's the choice, Brit Milah or,
Well, if he was already circumcised, he would just draw a drop of blood. So
right. Well, he wasn't letting anybody look at him. Are you kidding?
yeah, so it can be traumatic.
Yeah. So he said, no way. And luckily, Rabbi Greenbaum was he said he didn't have to do that.
Right. So that's because of the reform approach.
Right. And everybody was very relieved. Yes.
Okay.
Rabbi?
By the way, Barbara, did he go through any kind of ritual to become Jewish? Did he go to a mikvah? Did he? No. Yeah. Okay, Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, is there anything in the way of a ceremony for a adoption of an infant?
Yeah.
Not that I know.
I don't know.
Okay, well,
I don't,
in the book that you and I both have,
yes, yeah,
it's on page 25.
yeah. So there's a ceremony. Yeah, what the Reform movement has done, and Larry and I both have the Reform Rabbi's Manual, is they are creating rituals for many things for which there are not traditional rituals. And since I haven't been asked to do that, I haven't checked. Michael.
Rabbi, just to make sure I understood, the Reform position on a Jewish husband and a non-Jewish spouse, or one parent being
Right.
non-Jewish, the litmus test for the child being Jewish is evidence of entering into a Jewish life. The question is then, would that not also need to consider the spouse, the non-Jewish spouse who either chose or did not go about seeking that Jewish life as well?
Yeah, I would say technically no, unless it was if the non-Jewish spouse is agreeing to raise the child Jewishly, then whether the non-Jewish spouse lives a Jewish life or not is really irrelevant. Where I think it gets tricky is where you have families that say, well, we're going to raise our child in both traditions. And then it's just tricky. And I would say, it's up to the rabbi, it's up to, what's the issue? So, as Barbara was saying, if you have a child that's raised in both traditions, let's say the child, has a christening as well as a Hebrew name, child goes to Catholic school. And the Reform movement has actually taken as its official position that a child that's getting religious education in another religion should not be admitted to Hebrew school. Not all Reform congregations abide by that, but many rabbis would say if you have a child who is getting educated in two different traditions, that child would not be considered Jewish, even though one parent was Jewish, even though the mother was Jewish, which gets tricky. Okay, I'm going to move on to Baramba Mitzvah. So the words Baramba Mitzvah literally means son or daughter of commandment. I think a better translation would be mitzvah man or mitzvah woman. It's not a verb. This is a pet peeve of many rabbis. I don't bar mitzvah anyone. I just want to note the word bar is Aramaic for son. The Hebrew word for son is ben. And it marks the age at which one is responsible for observance of Jewish law. So the way I describe this at every bar and bat mitzvah is, as you can imagine, a newborn baby is not responsible for obeying Jewish law. An adult Jew is responsible for obeying Jewish law. So therefore, there must be an age at which you are required by Jewish law to obey Jewish law. And that age is 13 for a boy and 12 for a girl traditionally, because girls mature earlier than boys. Again, Reform treating men and women equally set the age at 13 for both. And so in theory, bar and bat mitzvah is the beginning of your Jewish life. And it's ironic, as I point out here, that it's all too common that it's the end of the child's Jewish life. And certainly that was true for me for 20 plus years. Is you got your bar bat mitzvah, people treat it like, I don't know, getting a graduation certificate, and then you don't have to worry about this stuff anymore. I am very flexible on many things, but this is one I'm not flexible on. I am often called upon to give kids a quickie bar bat mitzvah. Child turns 13, parents are Jewish or one parent is Jewish, and they feel guilty that the kid's not becoming bar mitzvah. So they will call upon me to do a quickie bar mitzvah, and I always refuse. I had this conversation with somebody just a few days ago. And I often tell people who tell me they are not bar mitzvah, or they're not bat mitzvah, I say, I have a surprise for you, you are. Because once you reach the age, you are subject to Jewish law. That's what bar and bat mitzvah means. And you don't need a ceremony to prove it or to take it on. I mean, it's not like a graduation ceremony where you get your diploma. What's going on at the ceremony is you are doing something in public that only an adult Jew can do. And typically the key element there is to read from the Torah on behalf of the community. There are other things I bet someone here has been approached by an Orthodox rabbi who said, were you bar mitzvah? And the person would say no. And the Orthodox rabbi would say, I'm going to lead you in putting on tefillin and saying the blessings, and now you are bar mitzvah. So that's the quickest bar mitzvah I can think of. And what the Orthodox rabbi is doing is only an adult Jew is commanded to put on tefillin. And so by leading him through the blessings, he has publicly demonstrated that. Larry.
Yeah, question came up at synagogue here a few years ago. Had a very smart young man. He was 14 years old, and he decided that he wanted to be a trustee on the board. And there was an opening, and was that permissible or not? Since he had his bar mitzvah the year before. So, yeah.
Well, I would say
it's
it's not a function of Jewish law. It's a function of the temple's bylaws, if they even address that issue.
Yeah.
Well,
we did. We did.
Yeah. And it's actually quite common. It's certainly true of Adat Elohim that there is a youth representative on the board. Typically, the president of the youth group is a ex officio member of the board, a member by virtue of his or her office. The ceremony as a ceremony dates to 14th century for men and 1922 for women. Judith Kaplan died in 1996. She was the first bat mitzvah. Her father is Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism and a conservative theologian who had 5 daughters. So it's not surprising that he came up with the tradition of bat mitzvah. And it's also quite common these days to have adult b'nai mitzvah classes. And again, theoretically, you don't need to have adult b'nai mitzvah class. If the person is Jewish and they're over the age of 13, they are Baramba Mitzvah. But I think it's a beautiful tradition of people wanting to participate in leading a service, learning the prayers, learning enough Hebrew to read a little bit of Torah. Michael.
Is that age requirement all across the board for all interpretations, or is that do the conservative or Orthodox interpretation have a different meaning for what a bar mitzvah is, or b'nai mitzvah, excuse me?
Okay, so b'nai is just the plural.
Yes, for girl or boy, sorry.
Yeah, so every movement agrees 13 for boys. The traditional movements would say 12 for girls. And Reform would say 13, treating them the same. And many rabbis are flexible, particularly for girls if they want to have a ceremony earlier. And many rabbis certainly are flexible to have a ceremony later. So a child, 14, 15, often you will have siblings that want to celebrate B'nai Mitzvah together. So you have one child who's 13, the other one might be 14, 15, 16, and you might have the ceremony together. And here's just some images of the child reading from the Torah scroll and, you know, how it gets carried away. And Sonia attended a bar mitzvah of one of her cousin's kids in Paris. And the Sephardi tradition, the Sephardim, if they can afford it, go way overboard with professional dancers and, you know, like what we would consider a wedding. In fact, the same family is going to be hosting a wedding in a year or two in Paris. And Sonia and I are definitely going to that wedding, because if they went crazy for a bar mitzvah, we can only imagine what they'll do for the wedding. Confirmation was a conscious attempt in the Reform world to imitate the Christian world. And it was introduced in the 19th century to extend these ceremonies for young women. And also typically it takes place when the child's 15 or 16. And rather than being an individual ceremony like a Baramba Mitzvah, it is typically a group ceremony, as you see in the pictures on the screen. And it often takes place around Shavuot. So moving on to marriage. I do a lot of weddings. I think last year I had 15 or 16 weddings. And at least one of you, I don't know if I'll just say he or she wants to be public about it, but I'm planning a wedding for at least one of you on the screen. So a marriage, very importantly, this is another item where there is nothing in the Bible about a marriage ceremony. The only thing that the Bible says, the Hebrew Bible says, is actually 7 times it says when a man takes a woman to be his wife. But there's no details. Interestingly, there are details on divorce, which, you know, we could spend some time talking about that, but there's no detailed information about marriage. So this is all in the Talmud, and actually I was doing some reading today and it took me to the Talmud. There's a tractate of Talmud called Ketubot relating to marriage, Ketubahs. And so the elements of a Jewish wedding are specified in the Talmud. And by and large, there are 2 major parts to a marriage ceremony. That's why there are 2 cups of wine. The first one is called Kiddushin, and you recognize the word Kadosh, Kaddish, the Kedusha. It means holiness or sanctification. And basically what's going on, again, it dates back to the biblical idea, which is, I would say, rejected or heavily watered down in modern times, certainly in the Reform world, of what's really going on is the husband is acquiring the wife. So to acquire the wife, he has to give her something. So at the exchange of rings, there is a tradition, I'm just going to hold up my wedding ring to the screen, I think you can see it, of having a ring that's very simple. And there's all kinds of stories about why it should be simple and round and unadorned. But my understanding of the reason for that is it's so she knows what she's getting and whether he is worth this deal. So basically the groom presents the ring to the wife, to the bride. She puts it on her right forefinger. And then he recites the magic words, which are, you see the English there, which are, Hare at mikudeshet li bataba at zo kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, which, you know, in English sounds quite beautiful because we have that word sanctified to me. Often you will see it translated as consecrated, which comes from the same English root, to me. But what's going on is the Jewish idea, and I don't know that we've discussed this, but the Jewish idea of holiness, kadosh, really refers to an exclusive relationship. And when God says, you shall be a holy people, what's behind that Hebrew word kadosh is an exclusive relationship between God and the Jewish people. Our understanding is God has other relationships with other peoples. So when he gives her the ring, he is basically saying, you and I and in traditional Judaism, where you could have more than one wife, it would be just the wife having only one husband. These days, it's last 1,000 years, and certainly in the Ashkenazi world, basically the couple is having a mutually exclusive relationship, and that's the basic idea behind this part of the ceremony. And what I was just reading today is some of, I would say, the in the world of Jewish feminism, they will eliminate that element of the wedding ceremony because it really stems from this idea of the groom acquiring the wife. Larry.
So the Ketubah actually is a wedding contract.
Haven't
And
gotten to the
it's some-
Ketubah yet. Yes,
When you
but you're
get
right.
there, it will be a contract, and people usually do that before they get married, before they go into the sanctuary. Is that correct?
Yes. So typically, the traditional thing that would happen is in ancient times, you would have the Kiddushin, the ring ceremony, a full year before the wedding. And basically that binds the couple together. And it was for the security of the bride to know that the groom is not going to run off and abandon her, because under Jewish law, he would actually need a divorce, even though they're not yet married. If they've gone through Kiddushin, if he gives her a ring and says the magic words, and she accepts it, doesn't throw it back in the face. I have some fun with this at weddings. But if she accepts the ring, then they are bound to each other, and they are denied intimate relations with anyone else, and they're denied intimate relations with each other. So again, I have some fun with this at wedding ceremonies with the permission of the bride and the groom, saying that, it lasted a year. That created a certain amount of tension. And so now it lasts about 10 minutes. But traditionally, as Larry is pointing out, another way that the couple is bound together, and it takes place just before the marriage, traditionally, is the signing of a marriage contract, which is a ketubah. I have it down here, which it traditionally is written in Aramaic, and it is a prenuptial agreement and divorce settlement, which protects the economic interests of the wife. It spells out how much money each of the parties is bringing to the ceremony, to the marriage. It spells out how much money the groom must pay the bride if they divorce. Husband pays the wife if they divorce. And it also gives her a security lien in his assets should she have to sue him for her ketubah, for the separation amount. It's written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. And I've never seen it translated into English on a document that you would hang up on the wall, because everyone would be horrified. So what is far more common in my world is what I would call a lovey-dovey ketubah, which spells out how much you love each other and honor each other, and it's in Hebrew and it's in English. And in a traditional ketubah, there's not even a place for the bride and groom to sign the ketubah. It's signed only by two witnesses. And again, I would say 95% of the ketubot that I deal with are lovey-dovey ketubahs, which are signed by both by two witnesses and by the bride, the groom, and quite often the rabbi. So that would take place just before the wedding, and then the wedding is accomplished by the recitation of 7 blessings. They're called the Sheva Brachot. And those are actually specified in the Talmud, which I now know is, I think it's Ketubot 8a. So I will chant those in Hebrew and in English at the wedding. And actually, I was kind of surprised. I went back to the Talmud to look at the blessings, and they are identical to the blessings that I chant. So the Reform movement hasn't touched those blessings as they exist in the Talmud. There is also traditionally a period of isolation, because Judaism recognizes a common law marriage. So what I've been told by my Jewish law teacher in rabbinical school is that if you have a a male and female Jew living together in the view of the community. This doesn't mean sneaking off to Motel 6, but actually living together, that they would be considered married under Jewish law. And should they separate, they would actually, again, in the conservative, I don't know what the conservative movement rules on that, but according to some Jewish legal authorities, they might need to get a Jewish divorce just by virtue of living together. So it is traditional in a Jewish wedding that right after the ceremony, the bride and groom are shuttled off into a little room. They have some food to eat because it's traditional that the bride and groom fast on their wedding. So they're really hungry. And also, if they were a traditional Jewish couple, they would have never been alone with each other without a chaperone. So this is the first time that they are unchaperoned and alone. And although there's not much time given, only God knows what takes place during that. One of the things I find amusing is how many people, after hearing this discussion, will tell me, you know, this happened at my wedding, and neither my bride nor I had the foggiest idea what was going on. The rabbi shuttled us off, put us in this room. 5 minutes later, took us out of the room, never explained why we were there. Via.
Sean and I are very excited to have you marry us.
Well, I am very excited to be marrying you two.
Thank you. So, as you know, I'm in the process of converting.
Mhm.
Sean and I live with each other.
Mhm.
So does that mean after I convert, does that technically mean we've married?
So under California law, absolutely not. There is no,
Yeah.
there's no common law provision under California law. So you could say under Orthodox law, you might be considered to be married, but Orthodox law would not recognize your conversion. So pretty much you're going to need me, Via. I hate that.
Sounds good.
Well, job security. Okay, so I'll just mention some of the symbols. The chuppah, I think I have an image of a chuppah, yeah, on the next slide, which is a canopy, which symbolizes the Jewish home and that it's open, with the idea that your home should be open to others. The ring, a symbol of continuity, also an exchange of clear value, as I mentioned. By the way, it is not traditional to have two rings for bride and groom at a Jewish wedding, because if the groom gives the bride $20 and the bride turns around and gives the groom $20, there's no net exchange of value. But I would say more than 95% of my weddings, I can't remember. I may have done one or two weddings in my life where there was only one ring. Sharing 2 cups of wine, I mentioned the Ketubah, and then breaking a glass. This is the one element that almost every couple I know is familiar with. It's probably originates as a pagan custom where the idea was that at happy times, evil spirits lurk. So we make a loud noise to frighten them away. And then what the rabbis did was what religions do all the time, is take pre-existing traditions and fit them into our own religion. So the rabbis made it Jewish, and the basic underlying idea is that even at our happiest time, we want to remember that there is brokenness in the world and that we have work to do. And then there's lots of other explanations about repairing things, and so that's a discussion of that. So here's some illustrations of the groom about to break the glass. I always ask the bride if she wants to break glass as well. Here's a couple signing a ketubah. Here is what a ketubah might look like. I'm sure this is a lovey-dovey ketubah. Traditional rings, and by the way, any ring is okay with me. I don't insist. And then what you can find, as Via's probably finding out, maybe others of you have found this out as well, there are an infinite number of ways to spend money on your wedding. And one of them is to buy a glass from a service, send the shards in. Don't ask me how they do this. I don't have the foggiest idea, but they reassemble. Now, maybe it's not the actual glass. I also have worked with couples where the shards of the glass will be made into a mezuzah or another decorative item. So Michael, Via, I don't know if your hand is still up, but I'll call on Michael.
Rabbi, I don't know if you were done talking about the symbols, but can you maybe clarify a little bit about the number 7 in a Jewish wedding?
Yeah, so I would say 7 is a magic number in Judaism. Certainly a major origin of that is the 7 days of creation, and 7 days until a Sabbath. So 7 shows up a lot in Judaism. We observe the most intense period of mourning called Shiva. The word Shiva means 7. So 7 shows up a lot. 7 is actually, the marriage is actually mentioned 7 times in the Hebrew Bible. In Ashkenazi weddings, but not Sephardic weddings, the bride makes 7 circles around the groom. And my own take on this is that just as God created the universe in 7 days, this couple is creating their own universe with 7 circuits. And again, as an egalitarian rabbi, I am perfectly happy. I always offer the couples the option to do nothing, which is fine. Traditional, she circles him 7 times. He circles her 3 times. She circles him 3 times, and they circle each other once, or a lesser number of times. So, but that's all. That's pretty much it as terms of the significance of the number 7. Okay, so more on marriage. Les, yes.
Could it also have anything to do with circling when Joshua circling 7 times before they took over the city?
Yeah, well, Joshua circles the city of Jericho 7 times, and the walls come tumbling down.
Would that have anything to do with the circling in the wedding?
I've never heard that discussed. I could certainly work it, but I would be dangerously close to being offensive. You could say the barriers between the couple could come tumbling down, or anyway. So, but I've never heard that comparison being made.
I just wondered if that the 7 had anything to do.
I think it is yet another reflection of how significant the number of 7 is in Judaism. For people who put on tefillin, the phylacteries, you wrap 7 windings around your arms. So 7 shows up all the time. Circumcision is 1 more than 7. So you have, an additional 7 and even a greater fulfillment. Probable, I think Bryce is the one who teaches me this. In ancient times, people were aware of 7 heavenly bodies, counting the sun, the moon, and 5 other planets that are visible from the earth.
Yeah, 7 moving lights in the sky. The 7
Right,
they
yeah.
were thought of as being 7 gods.
Yeah, so I think all that contributes to how often we see the number 7 in Judaism.
And one other thing, it troubles me a little bit with the Ketubah having prenuptials in there. When I got married a second time, someone said, "Are you going to have prenuptials?" And I said, "I don't want an easy way to get divorced. To me, I'm not going into a marriage to get out of it." And it kind of troubles me a little bit. I understand for protection of the wife and all, but why would we put in an easy way to get out of
I didn't say it
marriage?
was easy.
No, I mean, it sets up that if all this falls apart.
Yeah,
why would they bring it up at a time of-
so what it's doing is protecting the rights of the woman. The Bible specifies divorce as the Hebrew word is get. So, but the Bible doesn't specify what the husband's obligations are to the wife in the event of a divorce. So I think it makes it more difficult because he's pledging to pay her, whereas if it weren't there, he could just basically dump her.
Well, I guess I'm a little, overly sensitive to that because I just don't like the idea of going into a marriage with a back door to get out of it. Now, I'm not talking about in the Ketubah.
So are you saying, Les, that we should not have divorce?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying going into a marriage with the idea that if we, or when we get divorced, or if we get divorced, then we're going to do all of these things. I don't like the idea of going into marriage, setting up the possibility of divorce. It rubs me the wrong way in the sense that
your objection is duly noted. And I would say, you can send me a copy of your Ketubah and I'll tell you if it's traditional or not. Okay, moving on to marriage. Typically, a marriage is not performed on the Sabbath, and there are two reasons, one of which I find offensive, the other one I find silly. The offensive one is a marriage technically is a business transaction. The groom is acquiring the wife. So you don't buy stuff on the Sabbath. So I find that offensive because it's treating the woman as chattel. The silly one, which I don't have on the slide, as I noticed this morning, is that in Jewish tradition, you're not supposed to mix the joy of the marriage with the joy of the Sabbath. So I find that silly. So it may not surprise you to learn that I am flexible with marriages on the Sabbath. Many Reform rabbis are sort of flexible as you get toward the end of the day, because if you're going to strictly observe the rules of the Sabbath, you know, in New York, in the old country, in the summer, Havdalah is like 9:30 or later. So I can remember attending weddings in New York on Saturday night where the wedding wouldn't actually start until 10 or 10:30 at night. So I know many Reform rabbis who take the position, if they're not strictly Sabbath observant themselves. There are many Reform rabbis who are strictly Sabbath observant, and conducting a wedding anytime on the Sabbath would be out of the question. So many Reform rabbis will say, well, if it's late afternoon, usually the timing, if it's Saturday night, is dictated by the photographer, because they want to take pictures either before or after. So we've left the world of strict Sabbath observance anyway. And because I find the reasons offensive or silly, I am flexible on weddings on the Sabbath. Interfaith marriages are forbidden in the conservative and Orthodox world. Basically, traditionally, a Jewish marriage is defined as the marriage between two Jews. So the marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew would not be considered a Jewish marriage. And in the traditional world, they cannot officiate at such marriages. And I have conservative rabbis who are friends of mine who will often refer their couples to me, because quite often one of the, either the husband or the bride or the groom will be someone who grew up in their synagogue, in their conservative synagogue, but they're getting married. As I always say, endocrinology trumps theology. People fall in love, whether or not they are Jewish or not. So in the Reform world, it used to be 30, 40 years ago that maybe a third of Reform rabbis would conduct interfaith marriages and 2/3 would not. And I would say that's pretty much flipped. I would say 2/3 of Reform rabbis will now conduct interfaith marriages, and including many rabbis who changed their position. And the official position of the Central Conference of American Rabbis is to be opposed to that. Many congregations will, in the rabbi's contract, require the rabbi to officiate at interfaith weddings. And then each rabbi will set conditions under which he or she will conduct an interfaith marriage. And a much smaller number of rabbis will work with non-Jewish clergy to conduct a interfaith marriage. Less.
What about vow renewals between someone who's Jewish and then their spouse not Jewish? Is that something a rabbi would do, renewing the vows?
You'd have to ask the rabbi. I mean, I would have no issue with that. Yeah, I mean, but I also officiated interfaith marriages.
Got it.
I don't know if a Orthodox or a conservative rabbi would do that. My guess would be no. It's, by the way, very controversial in the conservative world. It's not so controversial in the Orthodox world. Until fairly recently, a conservative rabbi could not even attend an interfaith marriage, even if it was his own child's marriage. And that would, if he or she attended such a marriage or conducted such a marriage, he or she would be drummed out of the rabbinic organization. The interfaith couple may have problems in the conservative or Orthodox world. It was something that Barbara was describing earlier. You can have let's say you have an interfaith couple where the mother is not Jewish, the father is Jewish. They're raising the child Jewishly. They join a conservative synagogue. probably the synagogue will accept them as members, and they go to enroll their child in Hebrew school or even in a conservative camp, conservative Jewish camp, and it will be quite common that that will not be allowed. And certainly bar mitzvah and so on will not be allowed because according to conservative law, the child is not Jewish. Generally speaking, you will be welcome in a reform setting, and it's fairly common in the reform world to have special programming for interfaith couple. And then I always counsel people in terms of raising the children. And my own position is I think you should pick a religion, even if it's not Judaism, for the child, because I think a religious and a spiritual upbringing is important. In the world of divorce, traditionally, as the way it's spelled out in the Bible, the husband grants a wife a get, a Jewish divorce. And this causes problems because it's the husband that grants the divorce. So you can have a situation where, let's talk about Orthodox Jews living in the United States. The couple can get a civil divorce, but if the husband doesn't grant his wife a Jewish divorce, she cannot remarry. And so she is called an agunah, which is the Hebrew expression means a chained woman. That is true in the conservative world, but the conservative rabbis, having more flexibility, basically inserted a legal clause into the Ketubah. So Les, if you were unhappy before, this is going to make you more unhappy, because the Lieberman clause, and I don't think I've ever seen it translated in the actual Ketubah, specifies that if the couple gets a civil divorce, the husband hereby grants the wife a religious divorce, basically solving the problem of her being chained. And many Orthodox rabbis, since they don't feel free under Jewish law to vary the language of the Ketubah, what they will do is many Orthodox rabbis will insist that a couple enter into a prenuptial agreement like the Lieberman clause, or the rabbi won't officiate at the wedding. Let's see. And Reform Judaism doesn't have a Reform get. And this is a little controversial, I would say, in the Reform world. In Reform Judaism, there is no requirement that a couple who divorce get a religious ceremony to end the marriage. In Orthodox and Conservative Judaism, there is a formal ceremony which is called a get, and you need a beit din and the get has to be written in a certain way. There is a certificate of separation in the Reform world. I've only actually used it once and had a couple ask me for it years after they had actually gotten divorced. Okay, so I'm going to move on from marriage to the dispatched, hatched, matched, and dispatched Jewish mourning practices. So there are separate periods of time associated with Jewish mourning. The first one is from the person's death until the funeral. And there are people under Jewish law, again, everything is going to be a function of Jewish law, who are designated that they have to obey, according to Jewish law, the laws of mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. And the people who are obligated to mourn are the children of the deceased, the siblings of the deceased, the spouse of the deceased, and God forbid, the parents of the deceased. So they are the ones who are obligated to obey the laws that I'm going to describe in a moment. But I see, Jane, you have raised your hand. Les, I presume you just haven't taken your hand down.
Yeah, a very quick question that from the marriage. What about same-sex marriage?
Yeah, so I would say same-sex marriage, I think you won't find it taking place in Orthodoxy. I would say it is practically universal in the Reform world. I've never heard of a Reform rabbi that would object to same-gender marriage. And I would say largely it's accepted in conservative Judaism as well. And that's a fairly recent change.
Okay.
And by largely, I really don't know what the fraction is, but it's not, I think it's much more than 1 or 2%, but I'm sure it's not 80 or 90%.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good question. Okay, so in traditional Jewish law, and let me stop for a second. When I counsel people who are going through a funeral and planning a funeral, people who are not traditionally observant, and they ask me all kinds of questions, I always am happy to explain traditional mourning practices. But what I say is, if you are not going to be governed by Jewish law in these practices, you should ask yourselves 2 questions as you make decisions about what kind of casket to buy, how long to wait until the funeral, is there a cremation, is there not a cremation, burial above ground, burial below ground, and so on. The questions I encourage people to ask are, how do I honor the person who has died? And how do I comfort people who love the person who has died? So that's, broadly speaking, I will work out how we conduct this funeral based on those 2 principles. Jumping back to traditional Jewish law, from the moment someone dies to the funeral, the mourners, those categories, are called an onen. And there the focus is preparing for the funeral. So the people will often say, forgive me, I really don't know what I'm doing. My head is spinning. And my comment is always, this is exactly what you should be doing. Because a Jewish man for whom prayer is absolutely mandatory 3 times a day is exempted from prayer during this period of aninut. So the focus is solely on preparing for the funeral. The body is to be honored and treated with care. It's regarded as the creation of God and the dwelling place of the soul. So among the traditional treatments is a traditional cleansing called tahara. Their autopsies are not permitted under Jewish law. Embalming, removing fluids or removing organs and so on are not permitted under Jewish law, except to save other lives. So remember, a lot of Jewish law allows you to do these things in order to preserve health or safety. So there's big exemption on that one. And you're supposed to be buried with all of your parts. So I've heard, I don't know this certainly from firsthand experience, but if a soldier loses a limb in the war, that limb is buried, and then the soldier, when he dies eventually, might be hopefully decades later, will be buried in the same place. When a soldier falls in battle, there's an attempt to dig up the ground which holds his blood, so he's buried with all of his blood. I mentioned the closest relatives are exempt from positive mitzvot. There's a tradition of burying someone within a day, and that under Jewish law can be extended to honor the deceased. Typically in the Orthodox world, they will insist on burying someone within a day. Had this experience when Sonia's mother died in Casablanca. She was very ill, and we were on our way to Casablanca, and we fortunately got there just in time because they were going to bury her within a day, irrespective of whether we were going to make it there in time. And by the way, the idea of quick burial in Judaism is the reason why flowers are not traditional at Jewish funerals, because the reason for flowers is if you're having a wake in the living room and grandma's in a casket for days in the living room, you want to mask the smell. So that's why flowers became associated with funerals. I always emphasize flowers are perfectly okay at Jewish funerals. They are definitely not traditional. What I would say is more traditional is when you see language of families saying in lieu of flowers, the family has requested donations, and then they'll state a charity. Typically, before the funeral, there is no visitation, and traditionally the body is not left unattended. There is someone called a shomer who guards the body, and the reason for that in ancient times was a fear that the body would be attacked by animals or by insects or by body snatchers. And so there's traditionally a guardian. And these days when funerals can be delayed, that guardian can stay there for a long time. I was talking with a shomer at a funeral just a week or so ago, and I see these guys, and quite commonly the same guy. And he told me of one case during, the heart of COVID, where it was tough to schedule funerals, that he was with one body for, I think he said like 12 days, maybe more. And basically he's there 24 hours a day. And now the body is refrigerated, so he's sitting outside the refrigerating room reading Psalms and praying and sleeping there. And it's mind-boggling to me. And embalming is not practiced in traditional Judaism. And again, I'm not watching the chat because it's just too hard for me to do both. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask them. I'll tell you a story about simple shrouds only, and a simple wooden coffin. Wood, because you don't want to use metal. Metal was understood as being making swords and in war. And so at least one source I found that said the idea of metal in a casket would be inconsistent with the idea of resting in peace. The rabbis mandated simple shrouds to be buried in and a simple casket, because in Talmudic times, rich and important rabbis were having, fantastically ornate funerals. So by comparison, poor folks were being humiliated, and humiliating people is a big no-no in Judaism. So the rabbis mandated a very simple casket and very simple shrouds for everyone. Ironically, now someone dies and they have plenty of clothes to be buried in. And if you want to comply with this rule, you will have to buy a shroud, probably for a couple of $100 from the funeral home. So it's one of these areas that I find perverse. Barbara. You're muted, Barbara.
You mentioned cremation, I think.
Yes. So yeah, I don't know if I have well, let me talk about, let me continue, and I will absolutely cover cremation. One of the things that surprised me when I studied as a rabbinate is you don't have viewings of the body prior to the funeral. Jewish law requires, and California law used to require, someone to make a physical identification of the body. Now, since COVID, California law will accept a photograph. The family will give a photograph of the deceased to the funeral home, and they will make the identification. But it's considered to have an open casket is considered to be disrespectful. When I grew up in New York, they had viewings the night before the funeral. Sometimes as people were arriving, they would have an open casket. And these are Jewish funeral homes, and I just plain don't understand it. Bryce.
Yeah, so many of the things, this is just personal for me. I'm not trying to make an assertion, but they sound like, oh, no metal because we use metal in war. And I'm going, well, I use wood in war. They use rocks in war.
Yes.
I mean, when you look at this stuff, it's like, it's tradition, but it sounds like it's tradition interwoven with speculative
yeah, so what I would say is, broadly speaking, in Jewish law, decisions get made and reasonable people can disagree with those decisions. And I really, that's as far as I'm willing to go on that.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Typically, earth is placed in the grave. People can help to bury the deceased. In the traditional setting, the family members will completely cover either the casket, or if you want to get even more traditional, you'll completely fill the grave. We'll often put earth from Israel, relating to the practice of, or the belief in resurrection, because the idea in resurrection is bodies will, and don't ask me to defend this one, I won't, will tunnel their way to Israel. So we put a little earth from Israel, and typically from the Mount of Olives, a big cemetery right next to the Temple Mount, in the grave. Let me comment on cremation. cremation was never an issue in Judaism until fairly recently, because cremation is wasn't used, broadly speaking, in funerals, certainly in this country, I think until about 150 years ago. Certainly you have, the Vikings and Hindus and so on. And so the major issue originally with cremation was whether it constituted burial, because it's very clear that you're supposed to be buried. And then the question is, if you're cremated, are you buried? Now, I think you can argue if you bury the ashes, you're buried. But many people I know don't bury the ashes. They scatter the ashes, and they keep them on the, in the home. There is also the issue of physical resurrection. And so since you're not supposed to, artificially do anything to the body before burying it, certainly cremation is a dramatic thing to do to the body. But as a scientist, I would certainly recognize that cremation just accomplishes in a few hours what natural decomposition accomplishes over a few years. And then since the Holocaust, since so many Jews were cremated by the Nazis, I would say there is a particular distaste concerning cremation. But I'm going to be officiating at a funeral next Monday of a Holocaust refugee and the child of Holocaust victims, people who were murdered. And it was this person's wish, he was not particularly observant, to be cremated. And I know Holocaust families who have said they want to be cremated as a sign of solidarity with their relatives who were cremated by the Nazis. I would say cremation, certainly you won't find Orthodox rabbis who will put up with cremation. And in fact, in some cases, Chabad gets particularly agitated on this. I know families that have gone as far as being on the verge of issuing a restraining order to order their friendly local Chabad rabbi to stop harassing them before a cremation. And in the Reform world, I would say it is more than tolerated. I know of Reform synagogues that have cremation gardens on the site of their synagogues. Less.
Isn't the main concern about our soul? And when we take our first breath, our soul is breathed into us. Our last breath, the soul goes back to God. Is that Jewish?
I would say that's absolutely Jewish. A traditional definition of death is associated with cessation of breathing.
Okay, so if the soul goes back to God, who cares about the body? I mean, the soul is
okay. So let me answer. The answer is the body belongs to God, and it has been the residence of the soul for your entire life. So the body is to be treated with respect. And one way you treat the body with respect is all of these laws I've just enumerated.
Gotcha.
But I have heard Orthodox rabbis say, if you have a cremation, the soul can't go to heaven, and that. But I don't find any logic or justification for that. Bryce, I don't know if your hand is still up. Or you have
no, I just wanted to make say one thing. The really positive thing about this culturally and for families that are bereaved is that everybody knows what to do.
Yes.
All right. And so it takes all of the decisions away from having to be made by somebody that's in the middle of great grief, perhaps. And that, you could even let somebody else take over because it'll be done the right way.
Yes. And typically you're not in a great place to be making lots of decisions.
Yes.
And it also in Jewish tradition forces you to confront the reality of death and to get on to mourning quickly. So let me try and conclude this session quickly. There's a tradition of tearing the garments. Again, the obligated mourners are traditionally ordered to tear their garments, either with a ribbon symbolically or actually tearing your shirt. And the ribbon or the shirt tearing, that's not so easy to say, is on the left side over your heart for your parents and the right side for every other relative. And I mentioned burying the deceased. and a minyan for Kaddish. I'll talk more about the Kaddish in a moment. And then the Kohanim are not supposed to have contact with death except for their close family, and they're not even supposed to enter a cemetery. So in traditional Judaism, the Kohanim are buried at the edges of the cemetery. So family members who are also themselves Kohanim want to visit, they can visit without entering the grounds of the cemetery. So I think most of us know the mourner's Kaddish. One of the things I always point out at every funeral is, except for this very last line, Osei Shalom Bimromav and so on,
What does
the
Kohanim?
Kohanim are the
Rabbi.
priests. The priests.
Rabbi,
Yes.
Mike, we have a question. What is the meaning of Kobahim? What does it mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean?
A Kohen is a priest, and it's a male who traces his lineage back to Aaron, Moses' brother. Because in the temple times, the guy who was in charge of worship was the priest and was in charge of sacrificing animals. And contact with death would be an impurity which would disqualify him from officiating at those services. So that tradition of Kohanim not having contact with death continues. And among the Orthodox, if a plane is transporting a body, they have to disclose that on El Al, because a Kohen can't be on that plane because they would be in an enclosed space with the body. So the mourner's Kaddish, which is something we say at a funeral.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We say it at a funeral. We say it intensely in the first 7 days or 30 days of mourning. We say it on the yahrzeit. The anniversary is a prayer in Aramaic. And I know this is small to read, but it doesn't mention death or dying at all. It is a poem praising God, and there are lots of interpretations of that. And my own take on this is the essential teaching of Judaism is that God sends us in the world to make the world a better place. And as wonderful as the afterlife and the heavens may be, it's only in this world that we could do God's work. So when someone like, your Uncle Max has died, it's not only we who are sad, God too is saddened having lost such an amazing person doing God's work in this world. Can't do it in the next world. Some images from funerals. There's a tradition of putting rocks on a gravestone. It's just an indication that people visited. A candle that's lit for a week during a period of Shiva. And the anniversary of someone's passing, there's a 24-hour candle. This is a gravestone of a Kohen. And you see the fingers, which are the way a Kohen holds his hands traditionally to recite the priestly blessing. This is an image from Israel, and it could be from Morocco. When Sonia's mother was buried, this is what it looked like. There was no casket. A person was buried right in the ground. Here's a pretty typical traditional casket, very simple, no fancy wood and polishing and,
No nails.
No nails, right? There's no metal at all. Here's a traditional Jew actually tearing his garments, and this is a Kriya ribbon symbolically tearing garments. So after the funeral, we traditionally count 7 days. The Hebrew word for 7 is Shiva, for the intense period of mourning. And the basic idea behind Shiva is that you're not supposed to leave your home for those 7 days, except on the Sabbath. You're not to mourn on the Sabbath. The joy of the Sabbath overrides mourning. So if you don't leave your home, since men are traditionally required to pray in a minyan of 10 adult prayers 3 times a day, if you can't leave your home, how do you get to the synagogue? The answer is the minyan comes to you. So you may have heard this expression of a mourner's minyan. And there's a couple of references in the Bible about the 7-day period, both Joseph mourning for Jacob, and I think from the book of Job also. There's all kinds of laws related to this, and most Reformed Jews I know don't observe Shiva. I actually think, if you lost someone who's very near and dear to you, Shiva is not a bad idea to take 7 days out of your life. The traditional rules are you sit on low stools or on the floor. That goes back to the book of Job. You cover mirrors because mirrors are symbolic of vanity. You're not supposed to care about how you look. And there are some mystical traditions that the spirit of the deceased might be hanging out in the mirror. Again, not caring how you look. You don't shave or get a haircut. You don't leave except for the Sabbath. Interestingly, you don't greet mourners. So if you go to visit someone during Shiva, the tradition is you don't even say hello. You just go and sit with someone and you let the person set the tone. The person may want to talk about football, basketballs, or whatever, or they may just want to cry. I once went to a Shiva minyan where there were signs posted on the front door, please don't say anything to us, the family said. So the entire Shiva was in silence except for the prayer service. The rule is always go or always call. You may think that the family is bereaved, they don't want to hear from you, they don't want to have you visit. If you're concerned about that, call. They will tell you. But never just say, well, you know, if it was me, I wouldn't want people calling. If they don't want you calling, there's an answering machine or someone will answer. And I talked about Kaddish. So some images of Shiva, usually lots of food, often dairy, being symbolic of life, and eggs and round being symbolic of life. And in a pitcher of water, the cemetery conveys ritual impurity. So you pour water over your hands, saying a blessing to remove the ritual impurity. Gravestones will often have a pei and a nun. You see it there, you see it there. This is actually my father's gravestone, which is a translation of the phrase "here lies." And you will often see this phrase with the little apostrophes there. It's customary, and it comes from a phrase meaning "May his soul be bound up in the bond of life." Just moving on. I'll just tell you the story. I'm not going to read it about the Reichmans, who were fantastically wealthy Canadians, and the old man died. They were fantastically wealthy, but they were also Orthodox. And the old man died, and he left 2 notes for his sons, one to be opened immediately upon his death, and one to be opened at the conclusion of the 30-day period called Sloshim. And then the one that was to be opened immediately on his death, he said, he gave instructions. He says, I want to be buried with a certain pair of socks. And he told them where to find the pair of socks. So, of course, the sons took the pair of socks, took it to the mortuary, and the mortuary said, you know, in Jewish law, you are only buried with a shroud, nothing else. Shroud has no pockets, symbolize you didn't come into this world with anything, you're not going out with this world with anything. The sons objected, and they called the Beit Din, and basically, bottom line, no socks. The note that was opened 30 days later was to his sons, saying, boys, by now you realize that although you can make billions of dollars in your lifetime, you can't take with you as much as a pair of socks. So I just love that story. It is not traditional to be buried with anything. Having said that, I see this all the time. People will be buried with pictures, you know, of the family, other things that they loved, maybe a pair of glasses, maybe a golf ball, you know, all kinds of things, absolutely outside the bounds of Jewish law. And my guess is the Jewish law is a reaction to Egyptian practice, where the pharaohs, the wealthy pharaohs, were buried with a lot of stuff, including their servants and slaves, even though they weren't exactly dead yet. So Judaism absolutely rejected that idea. Let me see where we are. And I'll talk about after Shiva in a moment, but there are questions, so I'll just go in order. Via.
It's Sean.
Hi,
So I had
Sean.
a quick question about so you're supposed to bury, technically the rule is that all Jews need to be buried. I mean, obviously you see there's some exceptions. So I remember reading an article recently about the United States, and maybe it's not as bad here, but like eventually like you run out of space. Like I know, like for example,
Yes.
like I've had family that's been buried in Los Angeles for a long time, and like the place where they were all buried, they're full now.
Right.
So like, what do you do when you run out of room?
So the answer is the price of land goes up. You can bury one person on top of another, and that's actually pretty traditional. If you go to Prague and you visit the Jewish cemetery in Prague, you're walking along street level. The ground level of the cemetery, I would say, is a good 8 feet higher because they've been burying people. And of course, they're not using, probably that they're not using concrete liners. So bodies are decomposing, filling in the dirt, and you just keep burying people. And you said there are some exceptions. In traditional Judaism, there are no exceptions. So if you're a traditional Jew, you find some place to be buried in the ground. And it may not be where you want to be buried, but there's no exceptions. Clearly in the Reform world, cremation is not prohibited with vehemence, or not prohibited at all. Rachel.
Rabbi, could you go clarify on being buried with, you said that people are generally not buried with anything other than a simple shroud. And you kind of noted some secular items such as
Yes.
a photograph and other things like that. Do any of the interpretations of Judaism have an interpretation or an exception to be buried with your tallis? Or to be buried?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, and I should have put it on there, because traditionally you are buried with your tallis, a man, with one of the tzitzit cut off. I'm glad you mentioned that. I should have mentioned it. So in addition to the shroud, a man would be buried with his talit, with one of the tzitzit cut off, and I'm asked about this all the time. And again, not considering myself being bound by Jewish law, I consider myself bound to explain Jewish law. I will often say, if you want, keep grandpa's tallis to give to grandchildren. Particularly, if you have a pretty traditional Jew, I'll say he is going to have more than one talit. I probably have a dozen, but I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's absolutely true. Les.
What about gold teeth and stuff like that? Is that anything that's not allowed to be buried with?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say it's probably considered part of the body. So I've never heard of any Jewish practice that would say you should remove fillings. It's not just gold. What about fillings? What about a prosthesis? A lot of us have artificial knees and hips and so on. So I've never heard of a practice which would require removing that. But it's a great question.
Thank you.
So after the Shiva period of 7, there is a less intense period of mourning called Sloshim for 30 days, in which you are to avoid social gatherings or entertainment. Shiva and Sloshim are halted by major Jewish holidays. So if you have a funeral and you start sitting Shiva and Passover occurs, Shiva ends. And there's complicated rules on this. And I'm not expert on those rules, because most people whose funerals I conduct don't consider themselves bound by it. Children of deceased observe an 11-month period of mourning called Shana. And the idea there is that prayers for their parents assist them in their time of punishment in Gehenna. And see my class on Jewish beliefs about the afterlife. Yartzeit, which is a Yiddish word, is an observation of someone's passing on the anniversary of their death, lighting a 24-hour candle. And then traditionally it's the Hebrew date. So for every funeral, I print the Yartzeit calendar for the next 30 years. So like Hanukkah falling on different calendar days, the Yartzeit will also fall. There's also a tradition of roughly after a year of dedicating a stone. And it's not a matter of Jewish law. Typically people would wait, because until they had concrete liners, as the casket would decompose or the body would decompose, the ground would subside. And so if the ground subsides, if you put up a stone, particularly a vertical stone, too soon, the stone's going to fall over. So the tradition is you wait some time before erecting a stone. Okay, so that's all of the material I wanted to present. I'm going to stop sharing. Let's see. Where's chat? I think Cheryl, did you post that the yeah, the circumcision commercial from Saturday Night Live?
Yes, from Saturday Night Live. It's their skit on the Rabbi or Moyle doing the Brit.
Hold on, let me see if I can get it. I see the image, but it doesn't seem to want to play. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Maybe it's there. No. I don't, for some reason, I don't think I can play it, so I'm not going to try, but I promised to sing you a song.
Oh, goodness.
So years ago, let me see if I can find it. There it is. Years ago, I actually wrote an entire show. I think it was Rabbi Greenbaum's 13th anniversary or something for the temple. And I wrote a show honoring him. And it was kind of a retrospective of his life. And anyway, I won't get into it. But I wrote a song that a baby might sing, bear with me on this, on the baby's bris. So here we go. Hi world, I'm feeling fine. There's nothing special on my mind. How could there be? I'm only 8 days old. And everyone's saying, it's my bris day. It's my bris day. Whoa now, who's that little old man? He looks nice, but he's got cold hands. He's yanking down my nice new pants. My folks are fainting because it's my bris day. What's a bris day? Da, 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 da. It's my bris day. Every guy in the room is starting to schwitz. They got me sucking on Manischewitz, wanna scratch my nose and kick my feet. But I can't move them. Hey, what's this bris day? Yada da 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 da. What's a bris day? Bum 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 bum. Slow down. You're moving too fast. You know, I'd like this little thing to last. I have a feeling it's important to me. Ow! You'll never believe what they did on my bris day. And then I have a line here. I looked it up and I haven't seen this in a while. So my last line, I guess I used during the show, was, you'll never believe what they did on my bris day. And it'll be years before I'm feeling groovy. So thank you for putting up with me. And again,
thank you for being there.
I am going to stop the recording.